I can still hear the machines. Even now, years later, when I walk past any laundromat, that steady rhythm pulls me back. The low hum of washers in their final spin, the gentle thrum of dryers breathing warm air through cotton and denim. It's a sound that used to mean nothing more than Sunday evenings and the satisfaction of clean clothes. But that night, it became the soundtrack to everything changing. The fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh white, the kind of light that makes everyone look tired and washed out. But somehow Clay looked different under it. Maybe it was the way he leaned against the industrial dryer, one shoulder pressed to the warm metal, or maybe it was how his hair fell across his forehead when he tilted his head to watch me work. I was folding my shirts with the same careful precision I always used, creasing each sleeve exactly where it should be, smoothing out every wrinkle with methodical strokes. Clay found this endlessly amusing. He always had. While I sorted socks by color and folded fitted sheets into perfect squares, he would throw his clothes into whatever basket was closest and call it done. Tonight was no different, except for the way he was watching me. There was something sharper in his attention, something that made the space between us feel smaller, even though neither of us had moved. "You're too neat about it," he said, pushing himself off the dryer with his hip. "It's just laundry." His voice carried that familiar note of gentle mockery, the same tone he'd been using on me since we first met 2 years ago in our dorm's basement laundry room. But there was something else underneath it now, something I couldn't quite name. I didn't look up from the shirt in my hands, a blue cotton button-down that I'd worn to my economics midterm the week before. I focused on the way the fabric felt under my fingers, still warm from the dryer, soft from the fabric softener I always used. Focus was easier than acknowledging whatever was happening in the space around us. Clay reached over and grabbed one of my freshly folded t-shirts from the stack. He shook it out deliberately, undoing my careful work with casual indifference. The cotton unfolded like a flag of surrender, and I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger exactly, something more complicated. I set down a shirt I was holding and turned to face him fully. "Give it back," I said, but my voice came out quieter than I intended. The laundromat seemed to absorb sound, swallowing it up in the constant white noise of spinning water and tumbling clothes. Clay's grin widened. He held my shirt just out of reach, dangling it like bait. "Make me," he said, and the words hung in the air between us like a dare. I reached for it, stepping closer to where he stood against the dryer. The metal was warm against my palm when I braced myself, trying to grab the shirt from his hand. But Clay was faster. He caught my wrist, not hard, just firm enough to still my movement. Then his other hand found my shoulder, and suddenly I was pressed back against the dryer's surface, the warm metal solid against my shoulder blades. The shirt fell forgotten to the floor. Clay's face was closer than it had ever been. Close enough that I could see the small scar above his left eyebrow from when he'd run into a tree branch as a kid. Close enough that I could smell his detergent, different from mine, sharper and more woodsy. His eyes were brown in this light, though I'd always thought of them as hazel. They seemed darker now, more serious despite the smirk still playing at the corners of his mouth. The machines hummed around us, a dozen different rhythms layering over each other. The sound should have been soothing, familiar, but instead it felt like a curtain drawn around us, blocking out everything else that existed beyond this moment. The handful of other people who'd been in the laundromat earlier had long since left. It was just us now, just the machines and the fluorescent lights, and the sudden realization that something fundamental was shifting. His arm was still across my chest, not pinning me exactly, but creating a barrier I couldn't cross without asking him to move. His smirk was still there, but it looked different up close. Less casual, more intentional. Like he was waiting for something, testing something, daring me to name what was happening between us. I should have pushed him away. Should have laughed it off, made some joke about personal space, picked up my fallen shirt, and gone back to folding. That would have been the safe choice, the one that preserved whatever carefully maintained balance we'd been walking for the past 2 years. But I didn't move. Couldn't move. Maybe, but didn't want to. The distinction felt less important with each passing second. The dryer behind me was still warm, still humming with mechanical contentment. It vibrated gently against my back, a steady pulse that seemed to match something racing in my chest. Clay's breathing was different too, shallower, more controlled, like he was concentrating on something that required all his attention. This close, I could see that his smirk wasn't quite as confident as it usually appeared. There was something uncertain in the way it flickered at the edges, something that made him look younger despite being a year older than me. It was the first crack I'd ever seen in his easy charm, and somehow that made everything more real. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the white noise of spinning machines and the soft whistle of air through the building's old ventilation system. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of traffic, the occasional voice of someone walking past on the sidewalk. The normal world continuing its normal rhythm while we stood frozen in this pocket of fluorescent light and warm air. Clay's free hand moved slightly, his fingers brushing against the metal surface of the dryer near my shoulder. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, but it changed the weight of the moment. Made it feel less like a game and more like a question being asked in a language neither of us had learned to speak yet. I realized I was holding my breath. Had been holding it since the moment he'd stepped into my space, maybe longer. My lungs burned with the effort of staying still, of not disrupting whatever delicate thing was building between us. But I couldn't stay suspended forever, couldn't exist indefinitely in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The laundromat's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in stark relief. No shadows to hide in, no gentle lighting to soften the edges of what was happening. Just the two of us under harsh white bulbs, surrounded by the mundane trappings of weekly chores, standing at the edge of something that would change everything. I suppose I should explain how we ended up there, Clay and I, in that fluorescent lit space with its rows of industrial machines and the smell of detergent hanging heavy in the air. How two people can know each other for 2 years and still find themselves surprised by a moment like that, pressed against warm metal with the weight of unspoken things settling between them. I've always been the type who needs order. Even as a kid, I arranged my toys in perfect lines, sorted my books by height and color. My mother used to joke that I came out of the womb with a filing system. When I started college, that need for structure became my anchor. Classes at the same time every week, study schedule mapped out in 15-minute increments, laundry every Sunday at 6 p.m. sharp. It was the kind of routine that made sense to me, that felt safe in a world that often didn't. Clay was chaos walking through my carefully organized life. I met him on a Tuesday in September, first semester freshman year, in the basement laundry room of our dormitory. He was standing in front of a washing machine that was making sounds like a helicopter trying to take off, pressing buttons randomly and cursing under his breath. His clothes were scattered across 3 different surfaces, some clean, some dirty, impossible to tell which was which. I should have kept walking. Should have loaded my clothes into the machine at the far end of the room and minded my own business. Instead, I found myself asking if he needed help. He looked up at me with those brown eyes and that crooked smile, and something in my chest shifted without my permission. That was Clay's gift, I learned over the following months. He could make you want to help him even when logic suggested you shouldn't. He had a way of making disorder seem charming rather than careless, of turning his scattered approach to life into something that felt like freedom rather than irresponsibility. We became friends the way college friendships happen, through proximity and shared experience, and the simple fact of being 2 people trying to figure out how to exist away from home for the first time. He lived 3 doors down from me, and somehow that short distance became the foundation for everything that followed. Clay majored in art, which surprised no one who spent more than 5 minutes with him. He saw the world in colors and textures, in the way light fell across surfaces and the stories that objects told when they were arranged just so. His dorm room was a testament to beautiful chaos, canvases propped against every wall, brushes soaking in coffee mugs, paint tubes scattered across his desk like multicolored casualties. My room was the opposite. Business textbooks arranged by subject and publication date, a single plant on the windowsill that I watered every 3 days, a desk clear of everything except my laptop, and a single notebook. Clay used to say my room looked like a museum exhibit about college life, preserved behind glass for future generations to study. But somehow we worked. He would drag me away from my color-coded study guides to see movies I never would have chosen, introduce me to music that lived outside the safe boundaries of what I thought I liked. I would help him organize his assignments when deadlines loomed, remind him about appointments he'd forgotten, make sure he ate something more substantial than the energy bars he seemed to survive on. The laundromat became our neutral ground, the place where our different approaches to life met and somehow found balance. It was a 24-hour place 6 blocks from campus, the kind of establishment that existed in the spaces between neighborhoods, serving students and shift workers and anyone else whose schedule didn't align with normal business hours. Clay had discovered it during his first week of school, drawn by the fact that it was never crowded and played music from decades past instead of the aggressive pop that dominated most public spaces. I started going there because the machines in our dorm were constantly broken, and staying caught up on laundry was important to maintaining the structure that kept me centered. What I didn't expect was how the ritual would evolve, how Sunday evenings would become something we shared rather than something we did in parallel, how folding clothes would turn into conversations that lasted longer than the wash cycles, deeper than anything we managed in the fluorescent-lit hallways of our dormitory. The laundromat had its own rhythm, its own personality. The owner, Mrs. Chun, worked most evenings, reading romance novels behind the counter and dispensing advice about stain removal with the same authority she used for relationship problems. The regulars included a night shift nurse who always brought her daughter's school clothes, a grad student who wrote her dissertation between loads, and an older man who came in every Thursday wearing the same paint-splattered overalls. In that space, surrounded by the democratic hum of washing machines and the soft tumble of dryers, Clay and I found versions of ourselves that existed nowhere else. He was more thoughtful there, more willing to sit still and let conversations unfold naturally. I was looser, more willing to let my carefully maintained schedule bend around whatever story he was telling or observation he was making about the people around us. We developed traditions without meaning to. Clay always claimed the dryer closest to the window, where he could watch people walk past on the sidewalk outside. I always brought exact change, counted out in advance, while he scrounged for quarters in his pockets and backpack, and sometimes the cushions of the waiting area chairs. It was comfortable in a way that few things in my life had ever been. Easy and predictable and safe, right up until the moment it wasn't. The moment stretched between us like a held breath, and then Clay stepped back, his hand falling away from the dryer's surface. The absence of his closeness felt sudden and sharp, like stepping from a warm room into cold air. He bent to pick up my fallen shirt from the linoleum floor, shaking it out with exaggerated care before handing it back to me. "Sorry," he said, but his eyes held mine for a beat longer than the apology required. I took the shirt, our fingers brushing in the exchange, and something electric passed between us that had nothing to do with static from the dryer sheets. I folded the shirt again, hands working automatically while my mind tried to process what had just happened. The routine movements helped ground me, gave me something to focus on besides the way my heart was still beating faster than it should have been. Clay moved away, ostensibly to help with the rest of the laundry, but I could feel his attention like a weight. That was when the game began, though neither of us called it that. It started small, innocuous enough that I could have dismissed it as imagination if I'd wanted to. Clay tossing balled-up socks in my direction, aiming for the basket, but somehow always managing to hit my shoulder or arm instead. The throws were gentle, playful, accompanied by that lazy grin that suggested he was just being Clay, just occupying himself while the machines finished their cycles. But then he started moving closer when he threw them. Instead of standing across the narrow aisle between the washers and dryers, he positioned himself next to me, close enough that his elbow brushed mine when he wound up for each toss. Close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could catch the scent of his shampoo mixed with the clean smell of fabric softener. I found myself anticipating each throw, tensing slightly before the soft impact of cotton against my arm. While I looked up to give him what was supposed to be an annoyed glare, I caught him watching my face instead of aiming at the basket. There was something intent in his expression, something that made me forget what I'd been planning to say. "Your turn," he said, pressing a pair of my own socks into my hands. The cotton was warm from the dryer, soft against my palms. I looked at him, then at the laundry basket 3 feet away, then back at him. "I'm not going to throw socks at you," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I was weighing the balled-up cotton in my hand, testing its heft. "Come on," Clay said, spreading his arms wide in mock invitation. "You know you want to. I can see it in your face." He was right, though I couldn't have explained why. There was something appealing about the idea of abandoning my careful folding routine, about giving in to the kind of spontaneous silliness that Clay specialized in. Something that felt like permission to be someone other than the person who organized his entire life around structure and predictability. I threw the socks. They hit him square in the chest, and his laugh was warm and surprised, as if he hadn't actually expected me to do it. The sound echoed off the tile walls and metal surfaces, mixing with the constant hum of the machines to create something that felt private and shared at the same time. That opened the floodgates. What followed was 10 minutes of the most ridiculous behavior I'd engaged in since elementary school. We threw socks back and forth like we were 8 years old, laughing when they bounced off shoulders or landed in unexpected places. Clay managed to land one on top of my head, and I retaliated by nailing him with a pair of his own tube socks that unrolled mid-flight. But underneath the laughter, underneath the deliberately childish play, something else was building. Each throw brought us closer together as we retrieved wayward socks from under machines and between laundry carts. Each laugh seemed to lower some invisible barrier that had always existed between us, revealing something neither of us had been willing to acknowledge before. When Clay stepped closer to hand me a sock I'd overthrown, he didn't step back afterward. When I reached to grab a sock that had landed near his feet, I let my hand brush against his ankle as I picked it up. Small gestures, barely touches, but each one felt deliberate in a way that made my chest tight with anticipation. The game evolved without discussion, became something more tactile, more charged. Clay started crowding the space when I bent to retrieve fallen socks, his presence warm and solid behind me. I found myself taking longer than necessary to pick things up, hyper-aware of how close he was standing, how the air seemed to shimmer with possibility. When I straightened up after collecting a pair of socks from near the washing machines, Clay was right there, close enough that turning around brought us face to face with barely 6 inches between us. He didn't move away, and neither did I. The socks in my hands felt suddenly irrelevant, forgotten props in whatever scene we were writing together. "You're blushing," he said, voice lower than it had been during our impromptu sock fight. The observation wasn't teasing exactly, though his smile suggested he found my reaction amusing. There was something else in his tone, something that sounded almost like wonder. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right, I could feel the heat in my cheeks, could sense that my face was giving away things I hadn't meant to reveal. The fluorescent lights overhead suddenly felt too bright, too revealing, highlighting every detail of this moment I hadn't planned for. Clay's eyes stayed fixed on mine, and I realized this was another kind of invitation, different from the playful sock throwing, but connected to it somehow. A dare wrapped in an observation, a question disguised as a statement. The machines hummed around us, but their sound seemed distant now, background noise to whatever was happening in the charge space between us. The socks fell from my hands, forgotten, and this time neither of us moved to pick them up. That was the moment everything shifted, though I didn't recognize it immediately. The air in the laundromat felt different afterward, charged with possibility in a way that made ordinary actions feel weighted with meaning. We went back to folding laundry, but nothing about it was ordinary anymore. Clay moved differently now, with a new kind of awareness that seemed to extend beyond his own body to include mine. When he reached for a towel from the basket we shared, his arm brushed against my shoulder in a way that felt too deliberate to be accidental. When I leaned down to grab a shirt that had fallen to the floor, I could feel his eyes following the movement, tracking me with an attention that made my skin warm. The folding itself became a kind of dance. We worked side by side at the long table Mrs. Chun had set up between the washers and dryers, the surface scarred from years of use, but clean and functional. Clay folded his clothes with more care than usual, taking time with each piece instead of his normal haphazard approach. I found myself stealing glances at his hands as he worked, watching the way his fingers smoothed wrinkles from cotton t-shirts, the careful way he aligned seams. When we reached for the same sweater at the same time, our hands collided over the soft wool. Clay's fingers closed over mine instead of pulling away, and for a moment we stayed like that, connected by touch and the shared pretense of reaching for the same piece of clothing. The sweater was mine, navy blue and carefully maintained, but Clay held onto my hand longer than the mix-up required. "This is yours," he said eventually, but his thumb traced across my knuckles before he let go. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent something electric up my arm that settled somewhere behind my ribs. We started finding excuses to move around each other in the narrow space between machines. Clay would brush past me to check on a load in the washer behind where I stood, his chest briefly warm against my back. I would reach across him for the fabric softener, letting our shoulders touch as I stretched for the bottle on the shelf above his head. Each contact felt like a small confession, a way of admitting something without having to find words for it. We were testing boundaries, discovering what the other would allow, how far we could push before someone pulled back or named what was happening between us. The most dangerous moments came when we worked on the same piece of clothing. Clay would hold one end of the fitted sheet while I grabbed the other, and we'd work together to fold it into something resembling a square. Our hands would meet in the middle as we brought the corners together, fingers tangling in cotton and elastic as we tried to make the unruly fabric cooperate. But we started taking longer with these shared tasks, finding reasons to adjust our grip or smooth out wrinkles that might not have existed. Clay's fingers would linger when they touched mine, and I found myself prolonging the contact, finding excuses to let our hands brush again as we worked. The washing machine behind us finished its cycle with a mechanical chime, but neither of us moved to transfer the clothes to a dryer. We were too focused on the towel we were folding together. On the way, Clay had stepped closer, so our knees knocked together as we worked. He was watching my face instead of the fabric in our hands, and something in his expression made it hard to breathe properly. When we finished with the towel, Clay didn't step back to give me space. Instead, he shifted even closer, near enough that I could see the small flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count his eyelashes if I'd wanted to. The laundromat felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had moved inward while we weren't paying attention. "You missed a spot," he said, reaching toward me with one hand. His fingers touched the collar of my shirt, adjusting it with the same careful attention he'd been giving to his laundry. But the gesture was clearly unnecessary, an excuse to touch me that we both recognized, but neither acknowledged. His hand lingered at my collar, thumb brushing against the hollow of my throat where my pulse was beating faster than it should have been. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, but it sent heat racing through my entire body. I could feel my breathing change, becoming shallower, more conscious. "Thanks," I managed to say, though my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. Clay's hand was still on my throat, his fingers warm against my skin, and I couldn't bring myself to step away from the contact. The space between us felt alive with possibility, with all the things we weren't saying. The constant hum of the machines around us had become a kind of white noise, a backdrop that seemed to encourage secrets that made the rest of the world feel distant and irrelevant. Clay's thumb moved again, just barely, tracing along the edge of my collar with deliberate slowness. The gesture was intimate in a way that made my chest tight, crossing some invisible line we'd been dancing around for the past hour. When his eyes met mine, there was a question in them, something that asked whether I was going to stop this or let it continue. I didn't step back, didn't pull away from his touch, or make any move to break the spell that seemed to have settled over us. Instead, I found myself leaning slightly into the contact, giving him permission without words. The laundromat continued its mechanical rhythm around us, oblivious to the shift happening in the space between the dryers and the folding table. But I could feel it, the way something that had been building for weeks or maybe months was finally finding its way to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. The moment his thumb traced my collar, something fundamental shifted between us. What had been building for hours, maybe longer, crystallized into something that demanded acknowledgement. Clay's hand was still in my throat, and I could feel my pulse beating against his fingers, betraying everything I might have tried to hide. I turned toward the dryer behind me, ostensibly to check on the load that had finished its cycle, but really because I needed a moment to steady myself. The metal door was warm under my palm as I pulled it open, releasing a rush of heated air that carried the clean scent of fabric softener. I reached inside for the clothes, hyper-aware of Clay standing close behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. When I straightened up with an armful of warm cotton, Clay was right there, closer than before, close enough that turning around brought us almost chest to chest in the narrow space between machines. The clothes in my arms created a soft barrier between us, but it felt insubstantial, temporary. "Let me help," he said, reaching for the load in my arms. But instead of taking the clothes, his hands found mine underneath the fabric. His fingers slipped between mine, warm and deliberate, and suddenly the laundry we were supposedly managing became irrelevant. The clothes tumbled back into the dryer, forgotten, as Clay's hands moved to my wrists. He was watching my face with an intensity that made it hard to think clearly, as if he was trying to read something written there in a language he was just learning to understand. "Nolan," he said, and my name sounded different in his voice. Softer, more careful, like he was testing how it felt to say it in this new context. His hand slid up my arms to my shoulders, a touch that was gentle but unmistakably purposeful. I should have said something. Should have asked what we were doing, where this was leading, whether we were about to cross a line we couldn't uncross. But the words wouldn't come. All I could focus on was the way his hands fell on my shoulders, the way his eyes had gone darker in the fluorescent light, the way the space between us seemed to hum with electricity. Clay's hands moved again, one settling at the base of my neck, the other sliding down to rest against my chest. I could feel my heart beating against his palm, rapid and unsteady, and I knew he could feel it too. The touch was intimate in a way that made everything else fade into background noise. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. "And I will." It was an offer and a question and a confession all at once. Permission to end this before it went any further, before we named what was happening between us. But it was also an invitation to continue, to see where this moment would take us if we let it. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I'd been too careful to notice before. The way his breathing had changed, becoming shallow and controlled. The way his usual easy confidence had given way to something more vulnerable, more uncertain. The way he was waiting for my response with the kind of focused attention that suggested everything depended on what I said next. But I didn't say anything. Couldn't find words for the tangle of want and fear and recognition that was building in my chest. Instead, I did something that surprised us both. I reached up and covered his hand with mine, the one resting against my chest. The gesture was small, but it answered his question without requiring words. Clay's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected that response. For a moment, we stayed frozen like that, his hand warm against my chest, mine covering his, both of us balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. Then he leaned closer, and I could feel his breath against my cheek, warm and unsteady. His free hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone with the same careful attention he'd been showing all evening. But there was nothing careful about the way he was looking at me now, nothing tentative about the intent written in his expression. "I wanted this," he said, the words so quiet I almost missed them under the hum of the machines. For a long time, the confession hung between us like a bridge, connecting where we'd been to where we were going. I could feel something loosening in my chest, some tight knot of uncertainty that had been there so long I'd stopped noticing it. Because I'd wanted this too, had been wanting it without knowing how to name it, without understanding what the tension between us had been building toward. Clay's thumb traced along my jaw, and I found myself leaning into the touch, letting my eyes fall closed for just a moment. When I opened them again, His face was even closer, near enough that I could see every detail of his expression, could read the mix of desire and nervousness and hope that was written there. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in stark relief. No shadows to hide in, no romantic lighting to soften the edges of what was happening. Just the two of us in a public laundromat, surrounded by the mundane trappings of weekly chores, standing at the threshold of something that would redefine everything we thought we knew about each other. Clay's hand tightened slightly against my chest, and I could feel him gathering courage for something. His eyes searched mine one more time, looking for permission, for confirmation, for some sign that I wanted this as much as he did. I didn't pull away, didn't step back or break eye contact, or do any of the things that would have ended this before it truly began. Instead, I let my free hand come up to rest against his waist, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. It was a small gesture, but it closed the circuit between us, completed something that had been building all evening. Clay smiled then, soft and wondering, like he couldn't quite believe this was really happening. Then he leaned in, and everything else fell away. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative in a way that surprised me. After all the building tension, all the charged touches and meaningful looks, I'd expected something urgent, demanding. Instead, Clay's lips brushed against mine with the same careful attention he'd been showing all evening, as if he was afraid I might disappear if he moved too quickly. His hand was still cupped against my face, thumb tracing small circles along my cheekbone, while his other hand remained pressed against my chest where he could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. I could taste the faint sweetness of the gum he'd been chewing earlier, could feel the warmth of his breath mixing with mine in the small space between us. Time seemed to slow down, or maybe stop entirely. The constant hum of the washing machines faded into white noise, the fluorescent lights overhead becoming irrelevant. There was only this, the soft pressure of his mouth against mine, the way his breathing had gone shallow and uneven, the incredible tenderness of being touched like something precious. When he pulled back, it was only by inches, just enough to look at my face. His eyes were wide, almost startled, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. I could see myself reflected in his pupils, could see the flush that had spread across my cheeks, and the way my lips looked slightly swollen from the kiss. My chest felt tight, not with anxiety, but with something I couldn't immediately name. Relief, maybe, or recognition. Like some part of me had been holding its breath for months and could finally exhale. The kiss had answered questions I hadn't known I was asking, had clarified things that had been fuzzy around the edges for longer than I cared to admit. But it had also opened up new uncertainties. Because this was Clay, my friend Clay, who lived 3 doors down from me and helped me procrastinate on homework and threw socks at me in laundromats. This was Clay, who knew I organized my bookshelf by color and never remembered to buy groceries until his refrigerator was completely empty. This was territory we'd never mapped before, feelings we'd never named. I could see similar thoughts working through his expression, the way his certainty from moments before was giving way to something more complicated. His hand was still against my face, but his touch had become lighter, more tentative, as if he was suddenly aware of how much had changed in the space of a single kiss. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. The question was loaded with implications, asking not just about the kiss, but about everything that had led up to it, everything that would come after. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words got tangled somewhere between my brain and my tongue. Because I wasn't sure I knew how to be okay with this yet. Not because I didn't want it, but because wanting it felt like stepping off a cliff into something I couldn't see the bottom of. Clay's expression shifted, and I could see him starting to pull back, physically and emotionally. His hand began to slip away from my face, and something panicked fluttered in my chest at the thought of losing this moment, of letting fear dictate what happened next. "Wait," I said, catching his wrist before he could step away entirely. The word came out rougher than I'd intended, thick with something I couldn't identify. Clay froze, his eyes searching my face for some clue about what I was thinking. I wasn't sure what I was thinking. All I knew was that I didn't want him to disappear behind the careful wall of friendship we'd built between us. Didn't want to pretend this hadn't happened, to go back to folding laundry like nothing had shifted in the universe. "Don't make it a joke," I said finally, the words emerging from somewhere deep in my chest. My voice was quieter than his had been, but steady in a way that surprised me. "Don't make this into something we laugh about tomorrow." The request hung in the air between us, vulnerable and honest in a way that made me feel exposed. Because that was Clay's usual defense mechanism, turning serious moments into punchlines, deflecting intensity with humor. And I couldn't bear the thought of this becoming another story he told, another way to avoid dealing with complicated feelings. Clay's eyes widened slightly at my words, and I could see understanding dawn in his expression. He'd been about to do exactly what I'd asked him not to do, had been preparing to make some self-deprecating comment that would let us both off the hook, that would preserve the comfortable distance we'd maintained for 2 years. "I won't," he said, and there was something like promise in his voice. His hand came back up to my face, settling against my cheek with renewed certainty. "I'm not going to make this a joke." The relief that flooded through me was almost overwhelming, because this felt too important to diminish, too real to hide behind laughter. This felt like something that deserved to be taken seriously, to be acknowledged for what it was rather than what it was safe to call it. Clay leaned closer again, and this time when he kissed me, there was nothing tentative about it. His mouth was firmer against mine, more sure, and I found myself responding in kind. My hand fisted in the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, and he made a soft sound against my lips that sent heat racing through my entire body. This kiss was different from the first one. Deeper, more honest, less careful. It tasted like possibility and risk, and the kind of honesty that comes from deciding to stop protecting yourself from what you want. Clay's free hand found my waist, fingers pressing against my hip bone through my jeans, anchoring me to this moment and to him. When we broke apart this time, we were both breathing hard. Clay's forehead rested against mine, and I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. His eyes were closed, dark lashes casting shadows on his cheeks under the fluorescent lights. The laundromat hummed around us, unchanged by what had just happened between us. But everything else felt different. The air, the light, the way my skin felt inside my clothes. The way Clay looked when he opened his eyes and met mine, like he was seeing me for the first time. The machines around us began their gradual descent into silence, one by one completing their cycles with soft chimes and mechanical sighs. The dryer behind me gave a final tumble and went still, its warm metal surface cooling against my back. The washing machine, Clay had been ignoring, finished its spin cycle with a decisive click, leaving only the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic outside. In that newfound quiet, I became aware of how loud our breathing sounded, how the small sounds we made seemed amplified in the suddenly peaceful space. Clay's forehead was still pressed against mine, and I could feel the slight tremor in his hands where they rested against my face and waist, as if the adrenaline of what had just happened was still working its way through his system. "We should probably deal with the laundry," I said eventually, though I made no move to step away from him. The words felt strange in my mouth, mundane and practical after everything that had shifted between us. But the clothes were still sitting in machines, still needed to be folded and sorted and dealt with, despite the fact that the world felt fundamentally different than it had an hour ago. Clay's laugh was soft and breathy, more exhale than sound. "Probably," he agreed, but his hands didn't move from where they were touching me. His thumb traced along my cheekbone again, that same gentle gesture that was becoming familiar, becoming something I could already imagine missing if it stopped. We stayed like that for another moment, neither of us willing to be the first to break the spell that had settled over us. The laundromat felt like a bubble removed from normal time and space, a place where the usual rules didn't apply, and we could exist in this in-between state indefinitely. But eventually, practical necessity won out. Clay's hands slipped away from my face with obvious reluctance, and I felt the loss of his touch like a small shock. The air between us felt cooler without his proximity, less charged but also less safe somehow. The pile of clothes we'd abandoned during our sock fight was scattered across the folding table and floor, wrinkled now and in need of attention. Clay moved to gather them up, and I opened the dryer behind me to retrieve the load we'd forgotten about. The clothes were still warm, carrying the clean scent of fabric softener and the efficient heat of the machine. We worked in a different kind of silence now, not the comfortable routine we'd established over months of shared laundry duty, but something new and uncertain. I was hyper-aware of Clay's movements, the way he folded each piece of clothing with more care than usual, as if the mundane task required his complete concentration. When our hands brushed as we reached for the same item, we both paused, caught between the impulse to pull away and the desire to maintain contact. These small touches felt loaded with meaning now, each accidental brush of fingers carrying the weight of what had just happened between us. I found myself stealing glances at Clay as we worked, try to read his expression, to understand what he was thinking in the aftermath of our kisses. His face was more serious than usual, thoughtful in a way that made him look older, more uncertain than the confident person I'd grown used to over the past 2 years. The folding went slower than it normally would have, both of us taking extra time with each piece, smoothing out wrinkles that didn't exist, refolding items that were already perfectly arranged. It was as if we were both reluctant to finish, to reach the point where we have to pack up our things and leave this space where everything had changed. When we finally completed the task, our clothes sorted into neat piles and loaded into our respective laundry bags, we found ourselves standing by the folding table with nothing left to occupy our hands or distract our attention. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with all the things we weren't saying. Clay was the first to move, reaching for his laundry bag and slinging it over his shoulder. But instead of heading toward the door, he turned back to me, his expression uncertain but determined. "Walk back with me," he said, and it wasn't really a question. We'd walked back to the dorm together hundreds of times before, but somehow this felt different, like an invitation to continue whatever conversation we'd started with our kisses. I nodded, gathering my own things, and we made our way toward the exit. Mrs. Chin looked up from her romance novel as we passed the counter, offering us the same friendly nod she always did, oblivious to the fact that everything had shifted since we'd walked in. The cool night air hit us as we stepped outside, a sharp contrast to the warm, humid atmosphere of the laundromat. The sidewalk was mostly empty, just the occasional car passing under the streetlights and the distant sound of music from an apartment window somewhere above us. We walked slowly, neither of us in a hurry to reach the dorm and whatever conversation awaited us there. Clay's shoulder bumped against mine with each step, and I found myself adjusting my pace to maintain the contact, to preserve this small connection between us. Halfway back to campus, Clay's hand found mine in the space between us. His fingers slipped between mine with the same careful deliberation he'd shown in the laundromat, and I felt that same electric current of connection that had been building all evening. We didn't talk about what had happened, didn't analyze or define or make plans. We just walked through the quiet streets with our fingers intertwined, carrying our clean laundry and the weight of everything that had changed between us. When we reached the dorm, Clay's hand squeezed mine once before letting go, a small gesture that felt like both goodbye and promise. We parted ways in the hallway, each disappearing into our respective rooms, but I could still feel the warmth of his touch long after his door had closed. I sat on my bed surrounded by clean clothes that needed to be put away, but all I could think about was the way Clay had looked at me in those final moments before we kissed, like I was something rare and precious and worth the risk of everything changing.